In this episode, I speak with Steph Lowe, the Natural Nutritionist. We're diving into the topic of iron, all the signs and symptoms that you need to look out for to tell if you might need to check your iron levels and how exactly that relates to anxiety. You see, if you do have low iron, it may be a factor exacerbating the anxiety you're experiencing. And so, if that's the case, you definitely want to get on top of it so that you can help build your physical resilience so that you are less sensitive, less easily triggered by the environment around you. We're going to be talking about how to interpret your own blood tests. You can take a look. There's more to your iron levels than just your ferritin results. And Steph's going to talk us through that as well. And we'll talk about times when you actually might not have low iron, but you've been trying to treat low iron and thinking that's the problem when in fact it might be something else. And the iron could just be barking up the wrong tree. Okay, let's jump into the episode. It is jam-packed with insights. I can't wait for you to hear it. Steph, welcome to the Anxiety Reset podcast. I'm so excited to finally have you on the show.
Thank you. It's so great to be here.
What do you wish more women knew about iron and how important it is for their well-being?
Yeah, absolutely. It's such an interesting topic, but I think to answer the question as a starting point, we're really familiar with low iron and the symptom of fatigue or tiredness, but I think it's really important that the symptoms can extend far beyond that. And a common presenting symptom that I see in clinic is something like anxiety, which can absolutely be related to low iron. But it's more complicated than that. And I know we'll unpack it today, but it's just that there are people who have true low iron where we want to work out what the root cause is and treat that. And then there are people who have been told they have low iron, but might not. And that's another part of the conversation that I think that's really important, because if you have fatigue or if you have anxiety and you find air quotes low iron, sometimes that can stop the investigation, which means that it's that classic example of missing the forest for the trees. Whereas I'm really big on quite detailed testing or detective work. So we understand all the drivers, all the levers, and of course the root cause. Because if we have low iron and we know what the root cause is and we treat that, then we don't have low iron anymore, rather than it being in the roundabout, which we often see when it's sort of attempted to be addressed by our traditional medical model, which unfortunately in this case isn't root cause focused, where certain supplements or iron infusions or marina in some are the standard of care. Those pretty much, standard recommendations that don't address the root cause. And that's a whole problem in of itself.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And then we can sometimes, even if we are just looking simply at it and we just look at the ferritin number, sometimes that can be incorrectly elevated as well, masking an iron deficiency. So many pieces to this. What would you say? Okay, let's just start out with blanket. I mean, we covered a few of those symptoms: fatigue, anxiety. A lot of the people listening will be interested to hear that, but also potentially not aware that that's a sign of iron deficiency, or sometimes can be a key part of the anxiety that's going on. What are some other signs or symptoms of low iron that we can notice or look for? Is there anything we can do even just at home?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that the next two most common symptoms are that breathlessness and the heart palpitations, which of course, and this applies to low energy as well. Like these symptoms, I think, are quite commonly connected to low iron, but of course can be driven by other things. So that's where, again, we come back to the point of doing the detective work. But yeah, other symptoms we see with low iron, I mean, visually or like aesthetically, you get the dark lines or the bags underneath the eyes. You often see that in children who have low iron. I often see it in either vegetarian or vegan women, or women with a heavy menstrual period, which I want to talk in more depth about today. And then because it is just one of the many cofactors that we use to make our primary thyroid hormone thyroxine, there is a quite a strong correlation over into the thyroid space with more commonly an underactive thyroid, where we can see low thyroid hormones and an elevated thyroid stimulating hormone in response to that, which might be a subclinical or even a subclinical underactive thyroid, otherwise known as hypothyroidism, which then has a whole host of symptoms associated with it, like fatigue, like anything that's kind of sluggish, sluggish bowels, low libido, poor hair, skin, nail quality, so on and so forth. So we have a very underactive system, slow metabolism, and so forth.
Yeah, you've really covered that beautifully. And, it's the double whammy when you've already got low iron and then it's impacting your thyroid hormones as well, which are so important for our energy and every metabolic process.
Moods, yeah, everything.
Everything. So if you're
Just a
really
slightly important gland,
slightly important. And I think sometimes we don't even do that full investigation into the thyroid beyond just the iron studies as well, which is another piece to it.
I think that's a really important point, because when most of the time, and I think this will be your experience too, most of the time when someone says to you they've got low iron, what they actually mean is low ferritin. So I want to unpack that with you today, because a lot of the misconception comes from the traditional medical model, but it also comes from like our language, our cultural narrative about what we actually refer to as iron, which is incorrect, as we'll explore. And then on the thyroid side, the flat out blanket rule in Western medicine is that you only test that TSH. And so we consider that to be like just a very small part of the thyroid conversation, and a very inaccurate way to identify or rule out a thyroid condition. And so we're back to square one. We're back to the limitations of a Western model, which is kind of why I've ended up doing the work that I do, because I didn't wake up one day and decide to specialize in low iron or low thyroid or even perimenopause. But to be honest, they are the areas that I see as being poorly understood, poorly treated, and a lot of that is wrapped up in the limitations of our wonderful medical system in many ways, but not so much for a proactive or holistic approach to health.
I agree, and I often put it as, amazing we have the medical system for, certain diseases and kind of getting
acute care, yeah.
Yeah, acute care, making sure we stay alive. But in terms of enhancing our quality of life and helping us feel really well, it's not so much the focus, because there's a lot of people to manage and a lot of, higher priority things in that regard. But before we go into all of the facets and intricacies of iron and ferritin and all the ways that we kind of get it wrong, why is iron so important for how is it giving us energy? Do you want to just give a little explanation around how it creates energy for us?
Yeah, well, it's quite straightforward actually, which is why I think that people are pretty commonly across low iron, low energy. Like that's that really common conversation. It's because iron is in the blood. It's how we carry nutrients around the body. It's how we make oxygen. It's how we make our energy, our ATP, which is like our money, our energy currency per se. So without iron, we can't transport enough nutrients around the body into the cells and where they're required, and we actually can't make enough of that ATP, that basic currency of energy.
And where does the
link is that?
Yeah. So then building on that, where does the link to anxiety come in your understanding?
A few things. Like obviously from a hormonal perspective, I think there's a bit of a cognitive disconnect, because we don't make our hormones out of thin air. We need to be eating enough macronutrients, enough micronutrients, and we then need the physiology or the capacity for transport. So if we have a nutrient deficiency, we often see the collateral damage of that being in our production of hormones or being in our production of neurotransmitters. And obviously, very well, anxiety is multifactorial. It's quite circumstantial in 2023. It's often, I think, a result of the low fat era, where we haven't had enough of the macronutrients to make our hormones and neurotransmitters, and then the root causes that we see for something like low iron and how that relates to transporting those nutrients around the body and making energy. So there's quite a few drivers or levers to that, but a big part of managing anxiety starts with a lot of the foundations, as you know very well, because we need to make sure we're eating enough, and we need to make sure our body's functioning well for the transport of those nutrients. And I think, especially hormonally, we've got a world which pushes us into the extremes. So some hormones are driven quite low, others are driven quite high, and we can talk about that in quite detail, but it's that imbalance in either direction, which leads to an exacerbation of a lot of the symptoms like anxiety or heavy menstrual bleeding, which is a primary driver of low iron in women of menstrual cycle age.
Yeah, beautiful. And I think that would be probably one of the most common reasons for low iron that we can get our head around as well. It's like you can literally see it, like I'm losing blood from my body and that's full of iron. So it makes sense when we then get a blood test and we see our iron levels are low. What can be some of the more insidious ways that we can still have low iron, even when we're taking the supplements, even when we are eating red meat 1 to 2 times per week, or following those kind of recommendations? Because again, if you're following a vegan or plant-based vegetarian diet, as you mentioned, we're not consuming iron-rich foods in the same way, or those animal-based iron foods. So what are the more insidious ways that we end up with low iron?
Yes, I will answer your question in just a moment, but you think it's obvious, but it's not obvious. Like, women aren't taught to look at their blood. We don't even have a cultural narrative around that yet, because it's still seen as dirty and taboo. Our generations mostly, although that's finally changing, but we mostly start with Western medicine, which doesn't really look at a menstrual bleed, because why would you test a woman's iron studies when she's got her period or in week 2 of her cycle if you actually consider the influence of that monthly blood loss? Like, it's just not done. And then if I post that on Instagram, everyone's like, oh, that's so obvious. Why would you test her iron levels when she's bleeding? Yet that's standard practice.
Oh my
So
God.
again,
Yeah.
it's coming back to having, I think, doctors have a wonderful pathology understanding for acute care. They're trained in hospitals, so they see the extremes of either end in someone who's very unwell. So they aren't taught to look at, optimal health, and that's why our reference ranges differ. But there's a lot of detail, and if there's one mineral that's the most finicky, it's something like iron. So it does need very precise testing conditions, especially for a menstruating female. And then absolutely, we need to be having a conversation about hormones, because most women don't know how much they should be losing each month. And to be honest, the majority of people that I see in my little echo chamber are losing more than 80 mils, which has never been addressed. So how can they ever fix their, air quotes, low iron? So it's a huge area of low iron that is poorly understood.
I'm so glad you shined the light on that and really addressed it, because it just brings to light basically how shamefully ignored women's hormone cycles and unique physiology has been through medical research. And I do think we need to understand, here's our glass ceiling. This is still a problem and it's still not acknowledged enough. Thank God things are changing, but there are still those gaps. And even like when you say 80 mils of blood loss, because that's we don't want to be losing more than 80 mils over our whole menstrual bleed. So, but how are we measuring that? And if you are using a menstrual cup, I mean, I'm fascinated by this. So I had a few cycles where I like measured it and wrote down what my mils of blood loss were, just to kind of check and make sure that I was under that 80 mils. I kept a tally in the notes section on my phone every time I went to the bathroom. But who's doing this? And that's so abnormal potentially for a lot of people to do that. So brilliant to address that. And I guess we can put the call out to anyone listening to really have a think about your menstrual blood loss and maybe try out something like a menstrual cup to measure the flow. If we're not using something like a menstrual cup, what are some other ways we could potentially look at that, Steph?
Yeah, it's key, right? So it's where my education starts with anyone who's female of menstrual cycle age with low iron, because nobody knows. So I've never met a woman yet that comes to me that can report on that meal and that number of meals. So that's fine. Like, I don't expect any of our listeners to already know that, but you've already got some homework, right? So
Yeah.
your first piece of homework is to do exactly what you said. It is a matter of recording what products you use over your bleed. And so if it's a menstrual cup, it's easy because you can see 20 mils and 25 mils and you can add that up, right? But any other form of menstrual cycle products makes it a little bit more challenging. Like, a lot of women these days are using period undies, which I think are great, but often they're black and you can't see how full it is. So you're only making an educated guess. But if you use period undies, you need to know what brand, what size, and what absorbency, which will be available on the website of the company that you've purchased from. And obviously there's light and there's medium and there's overnight. So they'll give you a different mils and you can roughly do the maths. A super tampon is 10 mils. So obviously more than 8 super tampons each month is too much. And I meet women who are using 8 in a day or less.
Yeah.
And they're bleeding for 5 days. So we can do the maths on that. A regular tampon is 5 mils. A regular pad is 5 mils. An overnight pad is 15 mils. And I've got a really great graphic on my Instagram, which has all these mils. But essentially, the note section of your phone or your period tracker, a piece of paper stuck next to your toilet, whatever you like, just do a tally. And it will mostly be a guess, but you'll get pretty close to working out if you're under or over.
And it doesn't have to be perfect, but
No.
you might see like, okay, I'm a good, 10 or 15, 20 mils under, or I'm a good 10 mils or more over. And that 80 is just a nice.
Or 200 mils over.
Or 200, exactly.
The women that I meet that have severe heavy menstrual bleeding, like the flooding, the clots, the rearranging of the life for 2 days or 3 days a month, and the almost anemic picture that comes with that, they're losing 240 or even up to 360 mils a bleed. So that's in sometimes a few days, right? And there's been a couple of them that over the months have started to see improvements and really regretted not knowing where they started from, to have that comparison of, oh my God, I used to lose 360 and now it's 200 and now it's 100. And I think that's really important to be able to track that, because it's not an overnight fix. It's not years either, but sometimes it can take a number of months. And if all you're seeing is an iron panel that comes back that's not quite right or optimal, then that can be really disheartening. But if you can see a drop in the mils or a normalization over those months, that's so rewarding. And then the iron restoration will come.
Yeah.
And so I really think that tracking a lot of months, like maybe not every month in a row, but capturing that data in more than 1 month is important, because depending on the age of our listeners, certainly if you're plus 35, you can have very different menstrual months based on the amount of progesterone you've made, which is dependent on a number of factors, where your estrogen is, because we're usually moving into a more fluctuating estrogen picture, where months where it's high, it's going to thicken the endometrial lining. It's going to lead to a greater shedding and therefore blood loss associated with that. So 1 month is actually not a true picture for a lot of us. So getting a bit more data, I think, is a more, scientific and accurate way to know if you're above 80. And if it is, we call that heavy menstrual bleeding or HMB. And that is your root cause. Once you treat that, you won't have low iron. And then arguably, if it's the only root cause, your symptoms will resolve.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful. So coming back to my other question around, so we know if you're not consuming iron-rich foods, particularly those animal-based, actually let's cover that. What's the difference between consuming steak versus spirulina, greens powders, spinach? What are the other, all those plant-based, supposedly iron-rich foods, which have iron in them, but it's different. Why is it different?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So you're right. So basically the question was, why do we have low iron? I think at first is like checking in with the vegetarians and the vegans. So it's a dietary inadequacy because the plant-based sources are what we call non-heme iron, and they're not as bioavailable versus heme iron, like your red meat. And then we need B12 and folate and things like vitamin A found in our organ meats and copper for cofactors for iron production. They are found in animal food. So arguably a menstruating female who's vegan or vegetarian could potentially have more of a challenge, especially if she's got a hormonal or pathology-driven HMB. That would be a really more challenging case versus a female who is open to eating those animal products. That's where the treatment starts. I think red meat still is seen as unhealthy culturally. And so a lot of women think that it's not health or healthy to increase their red meat, whereas I'm pro-red meat as long as it's sourced properly. I'm talking sustainable, ethical, grass-fed, pasture-raised. I think it's a superfood because there is nothing like it that can provide you with not only iron, but many of the cofactors that I mentioned. But there's a whole cultural narrative around that, which is a myth that's been with us for 5 decades, that's not going anywhere, that often needs to be unpacked with women who we know have a high iron requirement, but might have some fear around these particular foods.
Yeah. And not to say there aren't other options as well, if that's really something that's against your ethics to consume red meat. But I do agree with you, Steph. I see it as a superfood as well. And I also think there's a big difference between consuming that grass-fed red meat versus and having it 1 to 2 times per week with lots of veggies and lots of other whole foods in your diet versus consuming burgers and fried food that's kind of all the and having this red meat every single day or 2 to 3 times a day, which may not be, it's all the boring message of moderation and balance.
Yeah, but it's also when you think about like those headlines or the news article where once again red meat is being criticized and there's some new study that's come out, that study is not looking at the meat that we're talking about.
Yes,
You should eat, right? That study is done in conventionally raised, hormone, antibiotic, the worst of the worst meat, and we're then extrapolating that to all meat, which is like illogical, but it keeps happening and it keeps fulfilling this message that meat is bad or that it will give you cancer or cardiovascular disease, which is bullshit. But you've got to look at the right science, and then you've got to go into obviously the detail and who's funding it and how that message is being portrayed in what you might see on the news or in some kind of reel, 15-second reel on Instagram.
I agree. In another life, I was at uni studying climate change. And in my third subject for this climate change thing, we had to do a project advocating and really going into all the ways that red meat may be impacting the climate and strategies. And so I went right through the research on it. And it was fascinating. And honestly, what I noticed and couldn't help but notice was that the studies are comparing, your everyday person eating meat and all sorts of different processed foods, whatever, against vegetarians who have consciously made a choice to shift their diet. So that there's definitely already the awareness of what they're eating and likely to be more of a nutritional focus for that person.
Yeah, more fiber, more
They're probably eating
antioxidants.
more plant foods. Yeah. So I was always interested in, well, what if we, instead of just comparing, Joe Blow eating hamburgers and beef burgers and things every day to a vegetarian, yogi, why aren't we also looking at the the omnivorous yogis who are
Yeah, totally. But that would be too logical. That to me is the only way you'd truly be able to manage it. You'd have and obviously it's not possible to do because it's too difficult and costly, which is one of the real limitations with nutrition studies. But yeah, if the only variable that changed was the addition of grass-fed meat and he or she was still having half a plate of vegetables, color, fiber, antioxidants, nutrients, etc., then you'd be able to answer the question. But I think we've been blaming cows for what fossil fuels do, and then you have to go into the funding and the vested interest and the rest of it. That's probably a story for another
Yeah,
time.
there's so much into it. But
Off track a little.
I will also flag the
Mm,
difference between, say, the beef industry in Australia versus the
mhm,
US. I mean, it's just
mm,
completely different, and we have to acknowledge
mm,
that. We've got so much more space here, so many different layers of ethics that go into our farming as well. So just wanted to
mm,
flag that, but also respect
mm,
to anyone plant-based and vegan, and know that you're also welcome here. And we see you and we love you as well in this discussion. Now I'm going to volunteer myself as a case study for just to illustrate that earlier question around more of the subtleties of how we can end up with low iron, because I was vegetarian or pescatarian. Was I pescatarian? Pretty much vegetarian for 2 years, and my ferritin levels plummeted, my iron plummeted, and I was exhausted. And I remember in the last couple of months before I actually reintroduced red meat, just deeply craving it in a way that I've never felt before. And when I first had it again, I just immediately, my body was just saying to me, yes, like, yes, thank you. I felt this rush of like energy. It was amazing, even though logically, biochemically, that couldn't make sense that I was getting, the iron from the meat immediately impacting me. But my body was rewarding me and saying, yes, I need this. And so I've continued to consume meat, but iron is a struggle for me, and it's something I always have to
mm,
keep on top of, despite consuming red meat, despite being a nutritionist as well, despite taking care of myself, taking care of my gut health. It
mm,
continues to be something I need to monitor, and my cycles, I'm not losing more than 80 mils a
mm.
month. So for those more subtle elements, we're not having the really heavy periods. We've got iron in the diet. Where are we also looking in terms of those underlying causes?
Well, you mentioned, I mean, this might not answer your unique scenario, so let's keep exploring that. But in terms of root causes, we've gone vegetarian or vegan, we've spoken about HMB, so then we would look to the gut. So we would have to look in or investigate if there was an impaired absorption, dysbiosis, and intestinal permeability, inflammation. And so that can sometimes be a big driver. And certainly, if she wasn't vegan or vegetarian, if she was losing between 40 and 80 mils, the next place I would look, I mean, we'd probably be able to do it all at the same time, but just in terms of this conversation, I would absolutely want to rule in or rule out an absorption issue, because you do meet women who seem to be eating adequate iron.
Yeah.
And that's a big part of it. It is, I mean, most people who have had low iron for some time have also tried the conventional route, which is Multifer or Ferrograd, and had some kind of constipation associated with that. Like, a lot of people have this real fear of iron supplements in general because of their experience of previous, more conventional, high dose, aggressive forms of iron. But it does signify the significance that the mineral can have on the gut. So
Mm.
that's where it's a little bit more complicated, because some people do find it harder to digest and absorb. I mean, it goes right back to the function of your gut. That is like upper management, your nervous system. It comes into your bile production, your pancreatic enzymes, your stomach acid. I mean,
Mm.
you do meet a lot of people who say that red meat doesn't make them feel great. And for me, that's a white flag that it might not even be dysbiosis or anything major, but it could be inadequate gastric secretions or ability to break down the iron that makes them feel nauseous or averse or what have you. So it really is quite individual, but go on.
Well, I was
Mm,
going to say thank you for bringing that up, because so many
mm,
people say, oh, I just feel so much better when I don't eat meat.
mm,
And
mm,
really, your body is designed to, at its optimal health level, break down and handle the consumption of animal products. It's or meat, let's say, just for simplicity's sake. So if you're finding that your digestion is uncomfortable when you're eating that, that's actually a sign of your digestive system not
mm,
working optimally, not the meat that's the problem,
mhm,
which is such a good point. And I will say,
mm,
I can on the odd occasion experience like a reflux attack if I'm
mm,
not careful with those reflux trigger foods. And so potentially my stomach acid could be playing into the whole iron absorption piece for me.
Yeah, it's interesting to look at. And this is where it ties into anxiety, because a lot of us with anxiety are very sympathetic dominant, as you know. So that is not the half of your nervous system that facilitates digestion. So we've got to obviously look at the strategies that you talk a lot about to promote that parasympathetic tone, to be able to activate the gastric secretions, to be able to digest all of our food, but in particular something like a steak, which is obviously going to require a lot more from our body than, say, a slow cooked meat or a mince that's been on the stove for the afternoon. So it's contextual, but it's very much the nervous system. And then of course we go into what that governs, like our gastric secretions and the whole gastrointestinal tract, really. So yeah, it's an interesting space, but I mean, most people think you're a bit woo when you get them to breathe before they eat. But once they experience the power of the breath activating the parasympathetic, which then can often mitigate a lot of their symptoms and air quotes food intolerances that didn't really exist in the first place, like that's quite life changing for people who are in that sympathetic dominance or overdrive for the majority of their hours.
So true. Sometimes it's the simplest things like just chewing your food properly, which I can
Yeah,
probably say is something I'm always working
it's
on,
huge.
and bring to chew. Chew, chew,
I mean,
chew.
I've
All
had
the
people
times.
who have had an IBS diagnosis for 20 years, and it's another topic, but it
Yeah.
is a very lazy non-diagnosis that just describes their symptoms. I mean, they know they've got an irritable bowel. They're living with it, right?
Yeah.
However, once you coach them on the nervous system and those strategies for optimizing gastric secretions, they haven't got IBS. Like
Yeah.
it's that powerful. It's that
Yeah.
powerful, but often overlooked.
Yeah. So true. So there's so many different places we can then explore in terms of the gut health part. And so I
But for
guess,
you,
yes. Yeah. What were you going to
for
say?
you, was it? Do you think it could be a cofactor thing? Do you think it could be lack of vitamin A or copper, or probably not the B vitamins in your case? But that's the other area that comes up a lot in someone who's very healthy that doesn't have any of those really big drivers or levers. What we then do is probably find a inadequacy in vitamin A or copper in the diet, which is not surprising given where those foods or those nutrients are found.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I can't say I'm eating my liver every day. In fact, I don't ever eat liver.
Do it, girlfriend.
If you study nutrition,
Mm,
and for those listening who are like, what the hell are they talking about eating organ meats? That's so gross.
yeah.
Well, it's kind of when you
Mm.
do study this stuff, you start to understand what a panacea it is of nutrients, and specific nutrients that are so readily absorbed by the body as well. So maybe I need to start adding some liver in.
Definitely do it, because again, our cultural narrative is that a multivitamin is a bottle of Swiss on the supermarket at Coles. And to me, that's insane. That's a shit ton of synthetic nutrients, very poorly absorbed, just certainly not what we need to function as menstruating women. Whereas looking at an organ meat, which you don't need to eat because there's a whole host of powders and supplements and capsules these days. I mean, as in eat. You don't need to start having lamb's fry for breakfast if it's not your thing. There's a way to do it that's easy. That's the original superfood or multivitamin. That's nature's multivitamin right there. Bit of liver pate for afternoon tea. Can't beat it.
And I think I remember
Mm.
stories of people who would like freeze it in ice cubes
Yeah.
when I was studying. I remember that kind of being an option of one way you can do it as well. So that's a potential, is the cofactors. And I'm pretty on top of my zinc levels. And we know that zinc and copper compete for absorption. So
Mm.
potentially my copper is losing out in that way.
Yeah, that's true. Like again, a conversation I have a lot is that if you do your due diligence and your detective work, then you'll know what's going on. Like if you've done your menstrual tracking and you've ruled that in or out, if you've looked at your iron studies appropriately, if you've looked at your zinc, copper, your B12, your folate, you'll know what's going on. It won't be a mystery anymore. And you won't be in that loop of supplements or iron infusions or a marina like your GP has been taught to prescribe. It's all about root cause. So once you work that out, it's easy.
Yeah. So there's a lot more to it than just, I've got low iron, take an iron supplement or get an iron infusion, which is awesome. So in terms of Oh, mental blank. Hang on. What was I going to ask you? Iron infusion. Oh,
Do you
yes.
want to talk about testing or
Yes,
go on?
that's where I was going to
Mm,
go. Thanks, Steph.
mm,
So in terms of the testing,
mm.
what's beyond just a low ferritin result, Steph?
Yeah. There's a lot to unpack here. So firstly, I'll go back to what I said about iron being very finicky. And so it's a mineral that is very dependent on what you do. So I'll give you a few examples, and this leads into like testing conditions. So in order to accurately test your iron, you need to be fasted, but for no longer than 10 hours. You need to have avoided alcohol, high intensity exercise, and supplements for 48 hours prior. And you certainly need to look at the week that you're testing in if you're a menstruating female. So we tend to say week 3 of your cycle. And you need to keep those testing conditions consistent to be able to do an apples to apples comparison moving forward. Because all the time I meet women where they've just been sent to the lab, not only, like I said earlier, when they're bleeding or in week 2, they've had a coffee, the iron's already moving around the body, so it's out of the liver. So what do you expect the ferritin to look like? It's going to be down. They might have a cold at the time of testing. There weren't other tests run, which we'll look at. And so it is very particular, but that is firstly key. Otherwise, you can go down all sorts of rabbit holes. So with the test that I run, I'll always ask for iron studies, which includes iron, and we'll talk about these, transferrin saturation, and ferritin. So you can look at that picture. I always request what's called a full blood evaluation, so you can have a look at least the hemoglobin, at the very least. And I always request something called CRP, or C-reactive protein, which is a marker of inflammation, because if there's inflammation, it will suppress your iron. It's called a pseudo iron deficiency driven by inflammation. So you then might think you've got low iron, go down this rabbit hole of treating it when it was actually the inflammation. And if you don't know that at the time of testing, you can actually make the problem worse, because iron is very specific, as in you can only absorb a certain amount per day, which is something else we can talk about. But if you start treating it when you haven't got a deficiency, you'll put too much iron in, you'll block the iron absorption, and you'll make the problem worse. So you'll actually unintentionally be perpetuating a problem or creating one if it wasn't there in the first place. So you've got to request iron studies with your hemoglobin and your CRP so that you can interpret it appropriately. But if you haven't met those testing conditions, your results need to go in the bin, and you do need to start again. So it's that detailed.
And whose doctor ever said, before I test your bloods, what week of your cycle are you in? Just as a starting point.
No one's.
Yeah.
Never in the history of my career. Yeah. And a lot of the time when you're at the doctor, you're there randomly and they'll say, oh, just pop next door. Do it now. It's easy. And so most tests I see are non-fasted. In the entire list of pathology tests, if you can imagine how many tests we could possibly do, there are literally about 5 that you can do non-fasted. And it certainly does not include iron studies or, what we're talking about today. So fasted means water only. It doesn't mean a coffee or a tea, and the other side of it is with regards to exercise, you can't exercise on the morning of the test, right? Like that will move iron around the body into the circulation, out of the liver, which is what ferritin is. It's the surplus in the liver. So it will look artificially low. And so sadly, a lot of the time when I meet someone, we have to start all over again. They've got some beautiful results they're hoping I can help them with, but they're redundant because I need to be confident there's truly low iron before I treat something that might be driven by inflammation or confounded by testing conditions or what have you. It is that detailed.
Yeah. And I mean, I kind of want to ask you, but I know it's a much bigger question. So if we go in and we think we've got low iron because our blood tests have shown that, we went to the GP, been very good at kind of taking care of our health and looking over it the way we're meant to, but we're still feeling exhausted, and it kind of looks like and turns out that their iron isn't low. What are some other, and maybe they're presenting with anxiety and fatigue. What else would you look at next, Steph?
If the iron isn't low
Yeah,
and
if
the
it
symptoms
turns
are still
out,
there.
yeah,
Mm,
exactly. If it turns out that it's not
mm.
low iron, but and they thought their ferritin was low, but then it turns out with more testing that it's not, where do you look to next for the fatigue?
I would look at hormones. So I would run mid-luteal progesterone estrogen tests
Mm.
at the very least, and probably even some cycle day 2 or 3 tests.
Which is a
Because
whole other
progesterone,
thing about
mm,
when to test the hormones as well, which
mm,
never happens. Like we
mm.
have to
But
know when,
progesterone is our anti-anxiety hormone. It is
yeah.
our calming neurotransmitter. It's anti-inflammatory. Like it it is driven low by stress, which someone with anxiety would have a strong predisposition to. So it would certainly be like low-hanging fruit.
Mm.
But could we go into, can we talk more about ferritin and how
Yes.
I interpret iron studies? Because what we want to do is once we've met the testing conditions, and we've got the results or the panels that I listed, then we need to acknowledge what we're actually looking at. And so ferritin is in the liver. Colloquially or culturally, it's always been referred to as iron storage, which I have a big problem with that narrative, because people hear storage, if it's air quotes low, they panic that they haven't got enough iron stored, and that must be the driver of all their symptoms. But the better term, the better language to describe ferritin is surplus. So it's like what's left over. So again, if you just had a bleed, you're not going to have a lot of surplus. So it's not logical to expect a lot of ferritin, right? So it is surplus, but it needs to be interpreted in context to the individual. And that's where I think it's really important to talk about the ferritin reference range, because in Australia, most labs still use that really wide reference range, which is 30 to 300. And there's been some kind of conversation about a bell curve where the middle must be around 100, which is ideal. And there is not a single piece of scientific evidence to say that a ferritin of 100 would be ideal or even appropriate for a menstruating female. And that reference range includes all humans. It actually includes children, teenagers, non-menstruating women, menstruating women, perimenopausal, menopausal, postmenopausal, and men. Like we can't, that can't be scientific. We need, obviously, in time to have very different reference ranges for males versus females, and then within females for their season of life. We also still try to use that reference range in pregnancy, which is even more ludicrous.
Wow.
And we don't need a ferritin of 100 as a menstruating female. Like, it's very, very normal. In fact, the majority of my women who have optimal iron, and this will cover in the next values, their ferritin can sit around 25 or 30. And they have been told since the dawn of time that's too low and they need an iron infusion. Whereas I then tell them that you don't even have low iron. So we look at transferrin, which is the most important marker, which is a measure of your iron hunger. So if your transferrin is high, and for menstruating women who are not on the oral contraceptive pill or any estrogen therapies, your transferrin needs to sit between 2 to 2.5 grams per liter. So if you sit within 2 to 2.5, you don't have any iron hunger. So therefore, you don't need an iron supplement or an iron infusion. And if your saturation, which is your tissue delivery of iron, so how it's getting transported around the body for the delivery of nutrients for production of energy, if your saturation sits between 20 and 30%, you haven't got an iron problem. You haven't got low iron at all. Even if your ferritin is around 25 or 28 or 30 or something that would normally be considered quite low by that conventional reference range that we just discussed. So yeah, a lot of the time I've either got a client who's got heavy menstrual bleeding, so we treat that and the low iron goes away, or she doesn't even have low iron because her results have been interpreted either with confounding test conditions or through that conventional lens where we're comparing men to women and we're not accounting for menstruation and we're not accounting for a thorough interpretation of the iron studies, which I would always start with transferrin and then transferrin saturation.
Wow. It makes me think about learning this stuff in my naturopathy and nutrition degree and going through those reference ranges. And not once was that idea brought up that this is kind of the same reference range used for men,
Mm,
women, children, pregnant women, everyone, doesn't matter,
mm.
because that's clearly such an important piece.
It's
And
so logical, isn't it?
there's almost this idea as well that like the more is better in some
Yeah.
ways, like more iron's better, more vitamin D is better, all of these elements, right? When
Mm.
yeah.
As we talk about that in relation to iron, and that's the criticism that I have of the conventional model. So we know that you can only absorb about 60 milligrams of iron a day, right? Yet multifer and ferrograt are 100 milligrams. So you meet a lot of women who have been told to have that every day. Ironically, it's too much. So you see their transferrin saturation too high, so greater than 30%. It increases something called hepcidin, which is your iron regulator. It regulates the entry of the iron into the circulation, and it blocks the absorption. So then her ferritin actually declines, and she gets told that it's not working. You must need more iron. And then she's prescribed 200 or 300 milligrams a day. And I just told you that she can only absorb 60. So iron physiology is poorly understood. These products, these 100 milligram per tablet products, have been around, I think, probably before, since we actually studied hepcidin and understood iron excess and understood iron physiology, but they're still being recommended. And, you know, the alternate, well, I have seen some improvements. I mean, I've been talking about iron for a while now, and I always sort of breathe a sigh of relief even if she's taking multifer or ferrograd, she's been told to take it every second day or twice a week, because then she's at least not doing more than 60 mil and pardon me, 60 meg and creating the problem. But again, it's still a band-aid. Like, I don't want to have to use iron supplements. I want to treat the root cause, and then the problem goes away. Right.
Because
And
the
that's
body,
really the bigger view.
well, the body can, in the right conditions, regulate itself.
I
It's never
truly
made
believe that.
it's never made sense to me why so many menstruating women need to be pumping themselves full of iron all the time. Like, why? I remember, like, yeah, questioning that a long time ago. It just doesn't make sense because nature has its own balance. And yeah,
I
that's
think we've been sold that health is complicated, though, which I don't believe. Like, I believe that I have a strong belief that health and a resolution of your symptoms is easy, but you can't do that without the root cause. And so the system doesn't address that because it's very good at acute care, which we said earlier. So it's very good at seeing low iron and offering you that quick band-aid. But it's only in recent years, since the boom of podcasts and social media and such incredible access to information, that we as a culture have really started to question why, rather than just say, okay, yes, I'll take that pill, or I'll do that infusion, or I'll use that band-aid. We're so much more savvy, and women especially, we've become so much better at advocating for ourselves, which is just so inspiring. And it's only going to become more exponential with generations to come. But we finally asked why. Like, why do I need to take an iron supplement? Or why do I need to take an antidepressant or what have you? Like, when we go into that detective work and we ask the right questions, as long as we know what the imbalance is, we can fix it, and we can get rid of our symptoms, and we can experience true health.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you for that piece as well, because I couldn't agree with you more. And I do agree it's an exciting time. Anything that empowers the individual, is a beautiful thing. And if listeners take one thing from this episode, perhaps it is just questioning that why, and knowing you're safe to ask those questions. And there are answers to those questions as well. Steph, I wish I could keep chatting to you.
More.
Tell me, for those who are listening who would like to learn more, who would just had their minds blown by your expertise, where can we find you?
Yeah, so my online home is thenaturalnutritionist.com.au. I'm over on Instagram at the Natural Nutritionist, and it's myself and a team of women who are really passionate about women's health and treating the root cause. So we're available. Come and say hi, and hopefully we can extend this conversation, because there's so much more we can talk about. But I've loved being here today. So thank you so much for having me.
I think we might need a part 2, Steph. Thank you so much. We'll have all those links in the show notes for anyone listening. And thank you for being here.
Thanks, Georgie. It's been so fun.
I am so thrilled to announce my new book, The Anxiety Reset Method, is now available in bookstores across Australia. It's on booktopia.com and Book Depository if you're international. This book will help you create the resilience you need to thrive and keep that anxious mind in check. Broken down into weekly attainable goals, the Anxiety Reset Method will take you on a journey to show you that you really can master that anxious mind. Thank you for listening. We have reached the end of this episode. If you enjoy this podcast and you find it helpful, I would really appreciate it if you would hit subscribe or share this episode on your Instagram stories and make sure you tag @Georgie the Naturopath. But that is all for today. Please be kind to yourselves. Know that you are enough and you are exactly where you need to be.